Let's move on. Let's take another question from Paul Cox.
With annual licences being confirmed for oil and gas in the North Sea, how is this compatible with reaching net zero?
Right, so this was in the King's speech this week, confirmed in the King's speech. Chris, kick us off.
Well, it patently isn't. And in fact, it won't, as we know from the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, it won't cut bills for anybody in this country. It won't do anybody any favours in this country. One of the problems is that the oil that might be extracted under this is now very heavy oil, so it can't even be refined in this country. It won't bring financial benefit to this country, and we shouldn't be proceeding with it. And if there were a Labour government, we wouldn't.
So why do you not... I mean, you know that you could stop it in its tracks. Given that Labour is very far ahead in the polls, it may become the next government. If Keir Starmer was to say, we will not honour those licences, the companies probably wouldn't bid for them. You could stop this, but you're choosing not to.
I'm not sure that that's right. We're saying that we're not going to do it. We're not going to issue licences.
But licences that have already been granted, you're not going to
well, presumably they're going to be licensed this year and they'll have run out by the time, because they're only for a year in each case, aren't they? So I can't see that that's the issue. The big issue is, how do we make sure that we are energy secure in this country? How do we get to net zero? How do we make sure that British energy is created in Britain and actually by British companies, so that the benefit comes to the UK rather than go off to Sweden or France or whatever? It seems bizarre to me that so much of the green energy that is being developed in this country at the moment is being done by companies from other countries. That's why we're suggesting we should create a great British energy company. Which would be British money developing lots of green energy in this country, good, secure jobs for the future, and the money coming back into the UK. It seems to me that that's a win-win-win. That's the better solution.
I'm asking about Labour's position, because obviously once a licence has been granted, even if it's on a yearly basis, once the drilling starts, it's started. That's something that Labour could
I think it's only for, as I understand it,
yes, but
we
once
haven't seen the legislation.
They start drilling. I'm just saying you could stop companies
No, because the
this.
licence is only for a year and it's only exploratory. So I don't think the problem exists as you see it, Fiona.
OK, well, let's agree to disagree about that. Liz?
The reality is that we need to look coldly at how do we actually produce the amount of electricity that we will need in future. The mix that we will need for that, the mix will be renewable, will be nuclear. And then we've got to make sure that the jobs that go with this are actually in our local communities. Now, for my own party, we've been working, you mentioned earlier that we've been working alongside in a cooperation agreement with Labour, that we're working to bring in an Cymru, an energy company that would engage with community supplies of renewable energy. And we would also be very interested in devolving the Crown estate, because that then would allow us to start controlling the way that we develop offshore wind, which has massive potential, and as is, of course, devolved in... The Crown Estate is devolved in Scotland, and you could start looking at supply lines and production, rather than, as mentioned, companies from abroad profiting from this. And particularly for Wales, where we're in a situation where, historically, we have produced more energy than we actually use, we actually require, but we have not been paid. We have not been able to grow our own economy on the back of that. There's some really exciting opportunities here, but we need also to recognise, from a government that has made the funding as difficult as possible, that central government has to enable the infrastructure for this to take place. And the dithering that I have seen since I became an MP in 2015 has frankly been, it's so depressing when we see this as an urgent thing that's coming down the track to us.
OK. And there in the middle, in the grey sweater.
Hiya. As a healthcare professional, the government's response to climate change terrifies me. It is the greatest threat to human health that the UN has declared. We're seeing currently unprecedented droughts in the Amazon. We're seeing the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We're seeing the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet. We're seeing sea temperatures rise faster than ever before. This is killing people in their thousands across the world on an annual basis. The UK government, or rather the Welsh Government, was the first government to declare a climate emergency. When are they going to start acting like it is an emergency?
David?
Well, first of all, there's been a huge reduction in the amount of carbon emitted in the UK since 1990. Well, I mean, that statistically is correct. I think it's about more than 50%, but you can look it up. The second point is that there's been a huge increase in the amount of renewables and the percentage of electricity that is generated from renewables. And again, you shake your head and say, but you can look that up on an app. However, we are going to need oil and gas until 2050. We've set out a pathway to get to net zero by 2050. We can't just stop using oil and gas overnight. We can decide whether or not we wish to import it from countries across the world, many of which are in quite unstable places, or whether we wish to make use of the oil and gas that lies off our own shores. And in doing so, we increase our energy security.
Exactly
we increase
how?
the amount
Just
of money that
explain
goes to the Treasury.
Exactly how do we increase energy security by doing that?
Because there's a certain amount of oil and gas in the world that's going to be used, and frankly, if it will all go onto an open market.
Exactly. Therefore, how does it increase our security?
In the worst case scenario, if it's coming from British shores, then Britain can make use of it. But more importantly...
Hang on. No, wait a minute.
Before you finish.
No, that's really important. No, I want you to answer that. You can make them in a moment, but just...
OK, as long as I can make them in a moment.
The government often talks... Hang on, Liz, wait a minute.
As long as I can make them in a moment, because we haven't quite finished yet.
The government talks about energy security, so just because I generally can't quite grasp this. If the oil or gas is drilled and a private company then decides it's going to sell it on the open market to whoever it wants to sell it to, how does that help Britain's energy security? We will surely be in line along with everyone else buying it. Or
well,
am I
we will,
something?
but I think you'll find that if we had to, we could make sure that it came into the United Kingdom. For a start, it would have to go via the United Kingdom to get out.
So how, what, you would hang on, no, wait. You can make them, but this is important. So you would force the company, the private company, in order to sell it to us at a time of...
Very hypothetical, Fiona, very hypothetical.
Well, you're saying it would increase our energy security.
We're not there,
I'm just trying to understand.
Well, we're not there yet. So the other point I wanted to make is there are 100...
Have you understood it?
No,
they're saying.
Well, perhaps this is easier to understand. There are 100,000 jobs tied up with the oil and gas industry in the United Kingdom. 100,000 people would be thrown out of work if we stopped drilling for oil and gas. And secondly, there are billions of pounds of revenue which flow into the Treasury whenever we sell that oil or gas
increase
abroad.
in taxes.
Billions and billions of pounds, which can be put into the health service or to other public services.
And there
so
are
what
people
Labour
who cannot
Applied
afford
want to do,
their heating bills, their energy bills this winter, and you are still selling it to the highest buyer abroad.
You, Liz, with all due respect, your party wants to scrap nuclear power. You want to get rid of nuclear power. Your party does. I don't suppose you do personally, but that is your party's policy. Chris wants to get rid of the oil and gas industry, and I'm just saying we need that stuff until 2050.
David, can I just
and there are a lot of jobs and a lot of money tied up in it.
Can I just ask you one thing, David? You, in the past, I don't know whether this is still your view, but you said that man-made climate change is in doubt.
No, I've never said that, Chris. Have a look at every speech I've made on the subject, and you'll see that I've qualified it. I've qualified it every single speech. I've said that CO2 has an impact.
So you slightly think it?
No, I've said in every single speech, Chris, you know, I love the fact that you want to look at my speeches. Have a look at them. Every single speech I've made, I've said CO2 is a warming gas and obviously has an impact on the climate. But I don't agree.
But you don't think there's a climate emergency?
I don't think we should be shutting down our oil and gas industry.
You don't think there's a climate emergency that we need to take seriously?
I think we can get to net zero by 2050 and we're taking it very seriously indeed. Look at what's going on in West Wales with all the floating offshore wind turbines.
But you won't devolve Crown Estate, so we get money for it.
Let's hear a bit more from our audience, because that's why they're here. The woman here in the front.
I think Labour government made it worse. You've now put our roads down from 30 mile an hour to 20 mile an hour, and we are shooting at emissions, and nothing more but emissions, and making it worse.
Say, we're going to come to that. So hold your fire. Hold your fire. Yes, the person there in this maroon shirt, I think you've got one with the glasses, yeah.
One of Wales's greatest assets is the coastline. Is either of the major parties brave enough to fund development of tidal power?
Tidal power, OK, we'll come back to... And then right at the back there, a man in the maroon sweater, yeah, also with glasses, yeah.
There's a balance between climate change and there's a balance between employment. As the gentleman mentioned, that with offshore would cost potentially 100,000 employment positions. Then we see already the Scunthorpe Steelworks are going to lose 3,000 employees as a result of turning to clean energy. South Wales will also lose 2,000 to 3,000, and then the Welsh Government have now succeeded in closing down the last coal sort of mining in that area. There has to be a level. If the UK is 1% of energy efficiency, then there's a time where we've got to consider the man in the street, the woman in the street, as well as the climate for our children for the future.
OK. Camilla. Is confirming annual licences for oil and gas in the North Sea compatible with reaching net zero?
Oh, absolutely not. It was as like a younger person. I have a 2-year-old. I'm terrified of the future. Also, you know, why invest all that money into what we know is a finite resource? We know there is only a certain amount. There are issues with refining it. It's going to be sent to other countries to be refined. Whereas if we could invest in wave power, in like wind power, can we not create the jobs around those industries here for something renewable? And infinitum, it seems quite short-sighted.
OK. Woman here in the front.
I completely agree, and that was also my point. You're talking about closing down of fossil fuel industries, and if we were to actually see that as an opportunity to invest in a green economy and create those jobs around it, surely that would be a way to ease the transition of that.
We can't stop using oil and gas overnight. It's going to take 20 or 30 years to do it. And why would we want to sack 100,000 people and then increase the amount of energy that we're bringing in from unstable parts of the world, which we're already doing at the moment? Why would we do that?
Anne.
I would say what underlies this, and it's a good question. Of course, it's incompatible, but the geopolitics of the world are incompatible with many things at the moment. You know, the great goods that we'd all like to go hand in hand and all turn up at the same time are proving rather elusive, and this is one of them. So, to an extent, I understand why this decision has been made, and I know, Fiona, you were testing whether it was not going to be available automatically to UK consumers, but the fact is you will be a player in oil and gas for a few more years, which you wouldn't have been if you hadn't done it. And I think, there's a bit of a common sense point there. Either you decide that you, on no circumstance would you ever do it because it's incompatible with net zero, and you would like to invest wholly in renewables. I thought tidal power was a very good point that the gentleman raised. But there is a problem. The gains of these things are much further down the line than the situation we're in right now. That's why there's a problem. It's not just like the government went eat cuckoo overnight. It's capable of doing that, but I think not on this issue. I think there is a real challenge here, which is how do you do this? And I kind of half agree with David. I think what will happen, I think it will be phased out sooner, but we have high oil and gas prices in the world for reasons that probably most people will grasp. War in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East, and that could get worse. I'm not surprised that the UK wants to have a transitional use of this. If you look into the legislation as I read it, or the proposal, it does say that will be reinvested in renewables, in more wind power, and in driving that on. I would say, well, let's see more of that. Let's see if that's really doable. But we're not the only country that is fudging away like this. I've just come back from Germany, whereas we know the massive kind of pivot from Russian gas has ended up with them reopening coal. Now, I'm very happy we're not reopening coal in the UK, and I think this is the lesser of two evils.
Do you want to just answer quickly the point, David, about tidal power? You asked
Well,
about
the
why
government
we're not
are investing in tidal power, but tidal power comes in at around £200 a megawatt hour, which is about 4 or 5 times the current rate. We're also investing a huge amount in wind turbines, offshore wind, which the price has come down on that to a level that actually makes it quite difficult to get people investing in tidal energy as well. So the point is there is a huge amount going on, but we're not going to be able to switch over to generating all of our energy from renewables overnight, and we are going to need oil and gas over the next 30 years, and I don't want to see 100,000 people needlessly losing their jobs while we bring the oil and gas in from other parts of the world which are not stable, which answers your question as to why that helps us, because we don't want to be dependent on unstable parts of the world for our energy.
But just imagine if in this country we actually had an industrial strategy.
But we've got one, Chris.
Which decided... No,
we've got one. We absolutely have. Look what's happening in Port Talbot, Chris, just down the road from you, where we are spending £500 million to create an electric arc furnace. It's going to save 5,000 jobs and a supply chain, and £100 million to support people who may lose their jobs as a result. That's an industrial policy, Chris. 2,000
people are losing their jobs down there, and another 3,000 elsewhere in the UK, and we're not going to be able to produce our own virgin steel in this country because you've not decided to act.
Because we have to import the iron ore, Chris.
David, please just let me finish a sentence and a half at least. Just imagine if all the wind turbines that are on the mountains in Wales were actually made in Wales. That'd be a strategy, wouldn't it? Because that'd be jobs for people in this country, and it'd be money coming back into the Welsh economy and into the British economy. And I would also like to see us insulating homes properly in this country. That would also be jobs, serious jobs for people in this country, and that would more than meet the 100,000. But you need to have a government that is determined to have an industrial strategy where we build things in our own country.
Is that a spending commitment then? I mean, everything you've said is about 4 kind of almost spending commitments components in there. You have to admit, it's not as simple
It's
as saying all of these things need to happen. Your Labour, I think, very reasonably came up with a green jobs strategy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've just laid
And it had
out.
to push it 2 years down the line because it couldn't afford 28 billion a year. We are in a really bad position on public finances, and to simply say, well, we can just absolutely have all these gains when we want them, and if only you just got rid of the Tories, it would all happen tomorrow. I think you know that's not quite the way.
Well,
it
that's
is.
why I didn't say any of that, and so don't.
You didn't.
No,
You
I
did.
didn't.
You said
I
let's
said very
insulate
specific. I laid out
it.
specifically what we want to do if we get to form a government. There's no guarantee that we'll get to form a government, but we would like to form a government. And of course, everything won't happen on day one. That's not how the world works, and I didn't ever suggest that it would. But if you had a government that started on day one to have a plan to put it in operation, then you might actually change the way this country's economy works.
OK. I'm going to stop it there because I'm going to move on to far and away the most popular question of the night.
We know what this is.